All right, guys, we're ready to move ahead with a discussion on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, but only as it relates to demand side policies and supply side policies for the broader macro economy. Some of this is going to be basically a history lesson so that you will know out of chapter 15 the key elements that you need to know for the test, but also what has played out over the 20th century. So let me gear up our PowerPoint here. I'll get rid of my webcam, and that way we can focus on just the key information that you'll need to know to be successful in this test. Now, some of you may recognize some of the things that I'm about to discuss as things that you studied already in American history, U.S. history. Typically, these are the areas where you are likely to hear about economics and its response to the broader problems facing American history. So this may feel like a short history lesson, but I'm going to stick to the key points and not focus on all the minutia that you've been hearing in some of the videos that I posted for you, okay? So you need to be familiar with our response to the Great Depression as being one that provided a larger role for government than what we had seen in previous decades. With such a long-term depression that lasted almost 2 full decades, a period of 20 years, it was time for government to get involved and provide, or at least attempt to make up for consumption and business investment spending that wasn't happening. So the idea is that this is the very first time in American history you really hear some things like Social Security and large government spending to generate and jumpstart a flailing economy. Some economists still today argue that World War II is what provided something for the U.S. economy to produce that dramatically lifted the country out of its doldrums and got things moving in the right direction. You may have also heard in the 1960s, there was a great social outreach program after John F. Kennedy's administration. Lyndon Baines Johnson took over and really tried to level the playing field by broadening or expanding things like Medicaid and Medicare, and tried to basically stimulate more demand because of what was going on with the Vietnam conflict. Later, in the 1980s, you probably are familiar with the term Reaganomics because of the supply side policies that went into effect at about that time. Economists are still debating today whether or not those policy moves were smart for the American economy and what they actually did. So we'll be talking about how to evaluate them here. But what you're seeing then is that before the Great Depression, we had basically classical economics. With the Great Depression, we're going to see Keynesian economics or demand side policies. With the 1980s, we'll see supply side policies. So those really are the big three that I want you to keep track of, okay? Let me give you a little bit more information about each one. Since I did write the test, I know some things you will see later. For classical economics, the easiest way I can describe that idea is that markets can fix themselves over the long term, so government should butt out. Quite frankly, if the economy is going to right itself in the long run, this tinkering by governments on the side to stimulus spend or to, cut taxes or whatever, that's just messing up the economy's recovery. So there isn't really a role to play. That's fine if your recession is like, a year and a half, 2 years. But when the recession turned into a depression and lasted much, much longer than analysts thought, then that made it clear that the government needed a stronger, more heavy-handed response. So through the 19th century, you could say we basically went back and forth with classical economics, but after the Great Depression, we really turned to see what government could do. Classical economics is the idea that markets regulate themselves. So that basically is the form of what it is. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus are the ones that were mentioned in that video that I shared with you, and they may show up on your test as classical economists. The Great Depression is essentially what ended that kind of thinking. And since that time, guys, we're bouncing back and forth between demand side policies and supply side policies all the way through the 20th century. So let's talk about Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics is named for John Maynard Keynes. He's a British economist who was working in London during the Great Depression and World War II. After World War II, he argued that the only way that you were going to ever see a London regain its position in the world was for government to take over certain key aspects of the economy and make sure that those areas were stable. Things like healthcare, things like transportation, other positions that were vital to the growth of an economy where there was no private investment whatsoever. And his ideas basically meant that Great Britain would be strong again by the end of the 1950s. In his argument, he mentioned a multiplier effect. He said that government dollars aren't the same as regular dollars because the way that they're contracted out, they get spent over and over and over. So a small expenditure on behalf of the government could generate a lot more spending in the broader economy. That is known as the multiplier effect. And that was the basis of what demand side policies were all about. That seemed to work after World War II. We saw a lot more of that kind of spending. So the idea is that government has the ability to replace the spending that may or may not be happening with individuals, businesses, and private businesses. The idea is that that means that at times during eras of recession, the government will step in with heavier spending programs and then step back during periods of high inflation. So the idea basically is what predicated most of the spending programs that you see in the 20th century all the way up into the 1980s. The multiplier effect, again, if you take an example like this here, 10 billion is sold in goods and services to the government. They will spend part of that. When it circulates to the rest of the economy, it could increase as much as 50 billion in GDP. That is what the multiplier effect is. Okay. As far as automatic stabilizers go, I know that that is on your vocab list and it's something I want you to be familiar with. Stabilizers are exactly what keeps like a large cruise ship from just moving around all over the ocean. They regulate and stabilize the broader economy. So the idea is that you want those to kick in almost quickly whenever there's a crisis. Some of them are automatic. That means that government doesn't have to take any action or make any new law in order for those effects to have to do their job. In some situations, discretionary stabilizers have to be designed, and they require congressional action and congressional action on a case-by-case basis. Literally, you have to look at every new situation and go, will we spend more or will we not spend more? So that requires a little bit of cooperation. Okay, so different kinds of stabilizers are sprinkled all throughout the economy. But for supply side economics, to getting back to our discussion here, in the 1970s, we saw stagflation. That is high inflation and high unemployment, and aggregate demand changes or demand side policies can only fix one or the other. So this came along with Ronald Reagan's administration. Basically, if there was a way that they could encourage businesses to spend more by attempting to affect the AS curve, then they argued they could have the best of both worlds. By shifting that curve forward, they could lower the rate of unemployment, but also lower inflation and kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, right? So this was more of more of a focus on the supply curve, which is basically controlled by big business, the large businesses that output goods and services to the economy. Starting with a few key wealthy businesses, this idea was that things would trickle down from the top to the people at the bottom, and that would be how you would help the average American. So the idea we'll talk about is based off of a controversial theory known as the Laffer curve. And I'm going to show it to you in just a second. But supply side economics really is synonymous with Reaganomics. So you can use those two words interchangeably there. Here's the Laffer curve. Arthur Laffer was a Harvard economist who was part of Reagan's transitional economics team. He argued that tax rates were too high. but lowering them wouldn't mean a decrease in revenue. He argued, if I can use my pointer here, that if tax rates are at a point like this on the curve, you could simply lower them according to his Lawfer model and decrease tax revenues, but increase tax, not, sorry, decrease the tax rate, but keep the same level of tax revenues. He said that the savings from a decreased tax rate would end up being spent in the broader economy, and that would make the average American wealthier as a result. Paying less in taxes means more spending. Okay, so the idea had its merits, it seemed at the time, as new thinking here. And it was based on the idea that taxes have a strong negative influence on output. Okay. The Laffer curve attempts to argue how both high and low tax revenues can produce the same tax revenues. Problem was, we didn't really know where he was going with his data or where he got this data in the first place. It seemed to be rather theoretical and ideological, pretty much untested in the 1980s. As a result of our experiments in the 1980s, actual experience has shown taxpayers don't really react strongly enough to tax cuts to increase that tax revenue. I guess if I could put it this way, if I told you that there was going to be a decrease in the federal income tax for 2020, based on the COVID crisis or whatever, I would have to ask you then, would that tax decrease be enough of an incentive for you to consider working like a 60-hour work week or a 70-hour work week or an 80-hour work week if you know the average work week's only 40 hours? Most Americans would say no. They would balance home and work in such a way that full-time would be plenty, and we would not see the benefit of that decreased federal income tax showing up as more wealth is earned somewhere else. It just doesn't seem to work that way. So this is something that's still being discussed today, whether or not it actually works, and it represents the last of the three things that I had to share with you. Just know that you have classical economics all the way up until the Great Depression, Keynesian or demand side economics all the way up through the end of the 1970s. From the 1980s forward, supply side economics from 1990s forward, guys, we really have been bouncing back and forth. So if you looked at Obama's administration, it was probably more demand side. If you looked at Trump's administration, it's a bit more supply side. So these theories or schools of thought are alive and well today, and people argue their merits on either side. With that being said, I'll leave this there for now. We will come back next class and talk a little bit more about how these policies affect your AD and AS model. Thank you.